Hi everyone, welcome to my Express and Node.js crash course video. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. I'll be covering what Express is, how we can install Express, how we can use Express to render HTML files, how we can integrate template libraries to generate HTML files with Express, and also towards the end we're going to create a pretty well fleshed out to-do list example REST API. So let's get right into it. What is Express? I'm just going to Google it off the bat and see what Express describes himself as. So they say, Express is a minimal and flexible Node.js web application framework that provides a robust set of features for web and mobile applications. The thing I want to emphasize here is that it's a web application framework and a pretty minimal one at that. A web application framework is really just a set of functionalities that help people develop web applications. And this might include, a routing system that maps URLs to functions or controllers. It might include a way to generate HTML files, such as templating functionality. It might include, ways to serve static files such as HTML, JS, and CSS. And if it's more of like an all-in-one solution, then it might include an ORM to interact with a database. But as it stands, Express is very minimal, and all it really provides you is a routing system and a way to manipulate and generate certain types of requests and responses. So I'm going to go into my programming folder here. I'll actually make this a bit bigger so you can see it. I'm going to go to my documents. I'm going to go to my programming folder. Going to make a new a new directory, and I'm going to call it to-do list. And then I'm going to change my directory to to-do list. And here we're going to initialize a new node project. So all I have to do is npm init y. This little y flag, all this means is say yes to everything, because npm init will try and generate a little script that you need to follow. So this generates a new package.json file, and now I want to open this in VS Code. So let me close my other VS Code instance. And there we have it. So we have this project generated. What I need to do now is create an index.js file, and this will be the entry point and probably the entirety of our project. And then I need to go into my package.json, and I'm going to add type module. And this will allow us to use ES6 features such as the new, more modern import rather than having to use require and so on. So if I save that, and then I just add a console log, and I'm going to say hello world. Let me view my terminal. I can run this using node index.js, and it'll show me hello world. But this can be a bit tedious, having to constantly, switch to my terminal, type node index.js, refresh it, and so on. So I'm going to install another dependency, and it's called nodemon. So if I do npm install nodemon, save dev, because we want it to be just a dev dependency, this will install it for us like so. And now I'm going to create a new script. I'm going to call it dev. And all this will do is call nodemon on index.js. And we can run this script by running npm run dev. Now nodemon is watching our directory, so anytime these files change, it'll refresh and rerun the project. So if I say hello world 2.0 and I save it, you can see it outputted immediately under here. So the next thing we want to do is install Express. So I'm going to stop the server for a second. And I'm going to do npm install Express. Express has now been installed, so all we need to do is start to write our application. I'm going to start nodemon again by running npm run dev. And now I'm going to import Express. So I'll do import Express from Express. We're going to create the app. And you do this just by calling Express as a function. We're going to create the port that Express will run on. All this does is it checks the environment variables to see if port has been set. If it hasn't been set, it just defaults to 3000. And now if we move on down, we can just do app.listen on the port that we've decided, and we want to pass a callback once the listener has started. Once it's started, we want to say console log listening on port, and we want to pass the port variable in there. So if we do that, NodeMon will refresh and it'll say listening on port 3000. So we actually have a little web server listening here at the moment, but it doesn't do a whole lot. All it does is listen, but it doesn't respond in any way. So to get it to actually respond, we're just going to create a route. So you can do app.get, and it says whenever anyone accesses, and this will be just the root of the project, run this callback function, and it takes a request and a response. And all we want to do is say return res.send hello world. Okay, so we have a little web server listening there at the moment. If I split this to the side and then I split this to the right, if I go to localhost 3000, it responds with the text hello world. And it basically says just listen. If I copy this, I can do another example, /example. And this, I just want to respond example text. So if I add example into the URL here, it'll give me this example text. So this shows you how URL routing works. So moving on, I want to demonstrate how we can use this to render static HTML. Express gives you a way to do this right out of the box. All we have to do is say app.use express.static, and we want to say public, and this will be the folder that'll serve static assets from. So I have a little example here already made. If I go to documents, go to programming, and then there's public in here. If I move this in, I want to copy the folder, and it just includes an index.html that has hello world in it, and this is a simple HTML page, and then it links to a styles.css that just kind of adds a little bit of basic styling to it. So now we're saying just serve static assets out of that public folder, and now if we take this away, it'll show us our example hello world. And if we change this to hello world 2.0 and refresh, it'll serve the newest version. And this can be pretty handy if you just need to serve static HTML files. There's probably better ways to do it though, using Nginx or something a bit better suited towards it. So that was how we can serve static HTML files and static assets, but we might want to use a template engine to do something a bit more sophisticated. So what is a template engine? I'll just Google it real quick. Express template engines. So a template engine allows you to use static template files in your application, and at runtime, the template engine replaces variables in the template file with the actual values and transforms the template into a HTML file sent to the client. This is a bit of a mouthful, but basically it allows you in your JavaScript to inject variables into your HTML templates, which can be really useful. And I'll show you an example in just a second. So the example I use here is using pug, which has this quite funky syntax with no angle brackets, doesn't really look much like HTML. I'm much more familiar with EJS. So if I do express EJS, you can see a lot of examples here. And here's the website for EJS. And I'll just install this as it is right now. So if I go back to my VS Code instance and I close what we're doing, all I have to do is npm install EJS. And if I go back up to our code, I just have to say app.set view engine to EJS. And now we have to create a new folder called views. And this is where the template files will live. So I can actually, wait 1 second, I will use that as part of the example. I'll call this views. I will move the index.html to views, and I'll rename it to index.ejs. And we'll just leave it as it is for the time being, and we'll leave styles as it is too. So if I go back to my index, in fact, let me copy this because I still need to serve static assets. There we go. I'll put this under it. Now if we run the server again, npm run dev, it's listening on port 3000. And it's still not doing anything because we've not added any of the listeners. So what we want to do is create an app.get, and on that we want to execute request response callback. Now what we want to do is say res, or return res.render index with an empty object. And if we go to localhost 3000, it renders this template, but the template doesn't actually make use of any variables at the moment. It doesn't really do a whole lot. So I'll show you how we can actually use it to inject HTML variables, or not HTML variables, JavaScript variables. So this object here, we're going to pass them through this, and I might want to pass a message that says, good morning world, and I want to pass the date. So I'm going to say new date. And now if I go back in, it still doesn't do anything at the moment, but now if I go back into index.ejs, I can now include these as variables. So all I have to do is $message and that. And then if I go here, I can delete this and I can say $, and I want this to be the date. Now if I refresh this, it'll say good morning world and it'll show me the current date time. And that's because we have been able to pass the variables from this JS controller into the template, which generates the HTML and then returns it to the client. This is a really handy way of building websites. In fact, my CS Book Club website is built using this exact method, and it's worked really well for me, and it renders very quickly, and I've been very happy with it so far. Okay, so that was just a quick taste of how we can render templates and generate HTML. And now we'll move on to creating a REST API. So let me close these other files. We don't really need these at the moment for creating a REST API, so let me delete the view folder and delete the public folder. So what is a REST API? There's really like two different definitions. There's a REST API as it was in the spec. It stands for representational state transfer. The original spec had some certain constraints on it. As it's used now, the term REST API really just means a web service that responds to HTTP verbs, and it returns, some form of programmatic format such as JSON or XML. So we can start creating one pretty easily using Express. So all we have to do is say app.use express.json. And this means that whenever we send a request in the JSON format, it'll just serialize it so it's in the request. And I'm just going to create a to-dos that'll contain our to-do list. So I'm going to put an example one in here. I'm going to call it ID1. I'm going to say clean the kitchen. And I want the status to be in to-do. And then I'll just add another one for the sake of it. Let me just copy that. ID2, it will be walk the dog. And I want the status to be done. So let's create a handler to this. So if we do something to the effect of app.get, and now we're going to add this API v1, which is just a little way of specifying that it's an API and this is the first version. And I want to say to do. And this should return all of the to-do lists. So if I take rec and res, this should be pretty straightforward. All we need to do is return res.status 200. And then we want it to be a JSON response. So we say res.status 200 JSON, and we add the JSON in here. So I want to say message, and this will just be a little text message that says all of the to-do tasks. And I'm going to put to-dos here. If we go to this in our browser, it'll work. So API v1 to-do. And you can see here, I'll actually pretty print it. It returns the message and then it returns all the to-dos, which works exactly as we expected. But this can be a bit tricky interacting with the REST API using the browser. So I'm going to use a special, well, not a special, but a tool specifically made for these type of requests called Postman. You can find it here. If you go into the Postman API platform, you can download it. It's a really handy little tool. So let me open that right now, actually. Close this browser. Postman. So I already have some requests from when I was testing this before. If I go in here, I'm going to delete the old one because I'm going to create these from scratch. Let me delete this. I'm going to create a new collection. I'm going to call it a blank collection. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to say it is the to-do list. And we want to create a request. This request, it will go to HTTP, localhost 3000 API v1 to-dos, send the request. It can't get it. Oh, it's because it's not to-dos, it is the singular to-do. And it returns it in the JSON format. Now if we save this, and we can rename it, if I open up the collections again, let me just rename this. I will say get all. And this works so far, but this isn't really enough. Maybe we want to get an individual to do. So we can use URL parameters. So let me just copy this route that we had before. And I'm going to paste it here. And I'm just going to add a / and then an ID. And this is a little variable that we can use. It's very handy. And the way that we can access it is by saying const ID equals request.params. And this gets passed as a string, so we need to actually convert it to a integer. So I want to say int ID equals parseInt ID. And that should work perfectly. Now, we want to search for an individual to-do item. And to do this, all we have to do is filter this list here. So what I'm going to do is say const to-do equals to-dos.find. This takes a function. I want to say where the to-do ID equals the int ID that we just got. And it'll either find it or it won't. So if we haven't found it, what we want to do is return res.status 404 not found JSON with a message that says to do with ID not found. And then if it has been found, we just want to return the singular to do. So if I duplicate this request, I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to rename it. I'm going to say it is get single. If I close this, so I'm in get single and I put /1, it'll only give me where the ID matches 1. And I can do where ID equals 2, walk the dog. But if I do ID equals 3 and it doesn't exist, it says to do with ID 3 not found. So this is how we handle the case of an item not being able to be found. So moving on down, we can actually delete to-do list items as well. So this is the verb, the HTTP verb that we're using. If you can see here, it is a get. But there are more HTTP verbs that exist. There are post, put, patch, delete, head options. They all do various things. But the next one I want to use is delete. So if I copy this again, and I just want to change the get to delete, and I want to keep the ID parameter the same. So it is finding whether it exists. If it doesn't exist, it says 404 not found. This all makes sense. The difference is, after we found it, we want to update the to-dos array to be the same except without this to do in it. So that's fairly easy to do. All we have to do is remove to-dos equals to-dos.filter. Takes a to-do item, to-do.id does not equal int id. And then we just have to update that. So to-dos equals remove to-dos. All this does is filter this array, and it returns all of the to-dos that do not have an ID of what we're trying to delete, if that makes sense. And then I just need to return a message that says to do, oh, let me actually change this to backticks. To do ID has been deleted. And then I want to return all of the to-dos. So let me just save get single here. I'm going to duplicate this again. Duplicate it here. I'm going to rename this to delete single. Now if I change this HTTP request to delete, because 3 doesn't exist, this should give me a 404 error, which it does, to do with ID 3 not found. But if I try and delete the first one, it'll say it's deleted and it'll return what's left. And all that's left is this second one. So if we get all of them again, you can see that we've successfully deleted one of the to-do items. So let me just save this and we can move on. What we want to do next is create a to-do list item. And all we have to do for that is, let me see if there's anything I can copy and paste. So I can copy this. I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to say app.post instead. Post is usually for creation. And whenever we send a post request to here, we want to try and create a to-do list item. So I know we're going to pass a name in the body equals rec.body, and I'll explain this in a second. If we've not passed a valid name, then we want to give them a 400, or what is it for a bad request? Let me see. HTTP. Yeah, so it's a 400 bad request. So if it's not a name, I want to return res.status 400.json and say message a name is required, a to-do list item. Okay, that makes sense. And if we have a name, all we want to do is create a new to-do item. I'm going to say the ID equals to-dos.length plus 1. It's going to have the name that we're passing in, and we're going to initialize the status as to-do. So we've created this object, and now we just need to push it to the to-dos list. To-dos.push. Perfect. And then we return all of them. I'll say successfully. There we go. And now if we, let me see, I'll duplicate get all. I'll rename this to create single. I'm going to change this to post. And in the body here, this is where we're going to send the name. So if I go into the body and I select raw and then JSON as the type, all I should have to do is say name, and it'll be, I don't know, go to the gym. And if I save that and send it, it is successfully created a to-do item, and it's included it at the end here, if you can see. Go to the gym with a status as to do. Now, if we don't include this name, so for instance, if I send an empty one, a name is required to create a to-do list item. If I just delete it entirely, it'll say the same thing. So that's some form of basic validation on it. And I'm going to create another one that'll say, pick up my friend from work. There. So we can see that we can add to-dos now. We can delete them, we can get all of them, we can get individual ones. The only thing that we need to do left is to be able to change the status of a to-do item. And for this, we'll usually, for updating resources, we usually use the put verb, the put HTTP verb. So we'll get started on that now. I will, where would I begin with this? I will copy this first request, this top one, and I'll bring it down. And I want to say put, and we need the ID of what we're going to update the status of. So all I need to do is say the const status equals request.body. So this pulls, as we can see in the previous example, we got the name that was passed in from the request.body, and we'll do the status in the same way. And we need to check whether it's a valid status. So we can say const valid status equals status. It either will equal to do or status equals done. These are the only two options we can have at the moment. We're going to say if it's not a valid status, we are going to return a bad request like we did last time. We're going to say status must be to do or done. Now that we know that the status has to be valid, we're going to get the ID like we did before. rec.params const int ID equals parseInt. This just converts the string to an integer. And now we try and find the index of this element. So to do that, JavaScript has a function. We can say const to-do index equals todos.findIndex. This will take a function. The function takes it to do, and it says todo.id equals int ID. If to-do index is equal -1, -1 is what it returns if it can't find it, then we want to return res.status 404. This is another 404 message, and say to-do not found. Perfect. So we validated that they're sending the correct status to update, and that we found that the to-do item actually does exist. So now all we need to do is update it. So we can say to-dos, to-do index, dot status equals the status that the user has sent. And now all we need to return is a little message that says the element has been updated. So I will say status has been updated, and then I'm going to say the singular to-do is to-dos, to-do index. There we go. Now if I duplicate this post, I rename it, or let me duplicate it first actually. I'm going to call it update status single. All right, we're in here, so I want to change that to a put. I want to, let me just add a random ID in here that won't work. So if I try and send that, and I want the status to be done, it'll tell me the to-do isn't found because one with an ID of 343 doesn't exist. But if I change it to 1, and I make this status something gibberish, like almost done, it'll say the status must be to do or done. So if I change this to done, we can now update the status of the to-do items. So we can see here, if I get all of them again, that works perfectly. So that's done. I want to change the second one to to-do because maybe I wasn't happy with how far we walked the dog. So if I go back here, change it to to-do, and then I get all of them again, you can see that the status has been changed. Now, One thing that you might have noticed is because we're just using an array, every time the server restarts, the array gets initialized back to the state we lose everything. You would probably want to use a persistent data store. It would be a database like SQLite or MySQL or Postgres. It could be MongoDB. You can really choose any of them, but just for this example, I've been using an array just for illustrative purposes. And what we've done here is we've been able to create a REST API in, maybe 15 minutes. And it actually does something useful. It tracks our to-do list items. So I hope you've learned something. If you want me to make a part 2 where I explain how I can host this using VPS, please let me know in the comments. If you learned anything from this, like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.